In Chapter 6, we talked about drawing media. This chapter, we're going to be talking about painting media. So some of the terms that we're going to cover, encaustic, fresco, tempera, oil, watercolor, acrylic, collage is included in this one as well, and then mosaic and tapestries. Some of the terms for the painting chapter overlap what we saw in the drawing chapter. So some of the key terms we're going to be talking about is pigment, medium or vehicle, support, ground or binder, fresco secco, bon fresco, and cartoon, gesso, glaze, alla prima, impasto, and easel. Paint is similar to drawing materials in the fact that we take a pigment and we mix it with some sort of a binder. A binder is an ingredient that makes sure that the product will stick to a surface, and the medium is a liquid that'll hold those pigments together without dissolving them. Then those can be applied to a support. That could be paper, that could be a canvas, whatever, with a ground or a primer, which is a preliminary coating on it. The first term we're going to talk about is encaustic. It comes from the Greek word meaning what burning in. Basically, it is a pigment, a pure pigment that is mixed with wax and resin. So when the wax and the resin are heated, they melt, which can then be used as a paint. And then once it is on the support and it dries, it hardens. It's a great way in some cases to create texture as well as just, the painting part of it. Jasper Johns was an artist, a very contemporary artist that worked with encaustic painting quite a bit. On the left, you see his 3 flags, and that is encaustic on canvas. So he actually painted on canvas with the wax and pigment. And you can see in the close-up, that's supposed to be of 3 flags, you can see the texture that's there with it. Fresco is a technique that mixes pigments with water and then is applied to plaster. And there's 2 ways to apply it to plaster. Fresco secco is Italian for dry fresco, or you are taking your pigment and you're putting it on a dry plaster surface. Buon fresco means a true fresco, and that is applying the pigment and water to wet plaster. The second one is a lot more permanent. It doesn't deteriorate as bad. And then a cartoon is a full-size drawing of the entire project, and they do the entire drawing and then they kind of lay it out on the wall. So you're talking about, you're not just painting on a wall, you're actually mixing it with the plaster so it becomes part of the wall. One of the greatest and most famous paintings by Leonardo da Vinci was a fresco, The Last Supper. Because it was done with the oil and tempera on dry plaster, it is deteriorating quite a bit. And you can see in a close-up how the colors are flaking off. This particular painting has had to have extensive renovations done to it to restore the color and the paints and all. The ceiling of the Sistine Chapel, done by Michelangelo in the 1500s, is a water-based pigment on wet plaster. Because it is done on wet plaster, it becomes part of the wall. It becomes a permanent part of the wall, and it doesn't deteriorate like the other one does. We should all be familiar with tempera. Tempera paint is one of those things that we've all dealt with in grade school, and The reason is because it's fairly inexpensive compared to other types of painting materials. So the tempera uses either an oil, a fat, wax, resin, some sort of a liquid, and then puts the pigment in with that. Egg yolk has also been used as a vehicle and a binder to hold that pigment in there. And I don't know if you've ever noticed, but if you saved any of your tempera paintings from when you were in grade school or whatever, over time, tempera tends to flake, tends to dry and flake off. Also, if you ever got a hold of a bottle of old tempera, many times you will open it up and it will smell like rotten eggs, and that's because it's got an egg yolk base. The gesso for tempera, you use a mixture of white pigment and glue applied to to the support as a ground for the painting. So the gesso does differ between the different kinds of painting mediums. This is an example of a tempera painting that was done on wood. It also has gold in there, and you can see that the colors have stayed pretty nice because of the primer on the support, the wood support. It stays on there pretty well. It's not going to flake off like it does if you're just painting on a piece of paper. Oil painting, this is something that I personally have never done but would like to learn. Oil paints are a pigment that's typically mixed with linseed oil. That's what holds everything together. And then as the linseed oil dries, the the, the pigment is kind of suspended there, and it's a little bit more transparent than other kinds. The glazes, we call them glazes when you take thin layers of that translucent color and you put it over something that's opaque. And that's how the Renaissance artist got the very subtle changes, light to dark. It's just glaze over glaze over glaze over glaze, and it gives a depth and it gives even a luminescence look to it. Alla prima means that the paint was completed all at once. Very difficult to do when you're talking about oil paints. And impasto is an Italian word meaning paste, and that is thicker and it creates a lot of texture, and you put it on with usually some sort of a palette knife rather than a brush. Jan van Eyck's painting of Girl with a Pearl Earring, done in 1665, is an oil on canvas. And you can see the colors are just so glowing. They're very clear. You can see that there were layers and layers of glazes put on there to create the depth that they needed that accentuate the value changes. Watercolor is one of my favorite mediums to use, but it does take some practice. If you want to get really good at watercolor, you have to work with it a lot. So watercolor is a pigment that is, if it's in either tube or pan form, it's got gum arabic in with it, and then you add the water to it to create the vehicle. The watercolor itself is transparent, so you can see through it. You can add layers and layers and layers of watercolor, similar to how you would do oil paintings, and that that creates the look that we all know from watercolor. A gouache is a watercolor that has a white pigment added to it. So because it has that white pigment added to it, it makes the colors opaque. Transparent means you can see through it. Opaque means you can't. Winslow Homer did a lot of watercolor work. Watercolor is typically a little looser because you're working with water. It tends to dry a little faster, so you have to be kind of quick, but you can still get a lot of detail with it. Acrylic paints are synthetic. There's acrylic paints anywhere from the paint that you paint on your walls, those are a latex acrylic, to the fine art paints. The pigment is put into an acrylic resin, and then that, when added with water, creates the smooth paintable acrylic paint. As it dries, the resin particles kind of come together and they form a really flexible, and it's waterproof as well, and they dry very quickly. One of the nice things about acrylic painting is that if you make a boo-boo, you can let it dry and you can paint over it because they are opaque. This is one of Andy Warhol's famous Campbell's Soup can paintings done in 1962. It is acrylic on a canvas. Much of the time, an artist will paint with their surface on an easel, and that easel will hold whatever surface that you're using vertically. And for some people, that's easier to use, or some artists, especially modern artists, use walls, floors. We talked about Jackson Pollock, where he would put canvas down on the floor. But a traditional easel is used to enable the artist to actually face the work on a full front way, so that they can see what it is they're painting and how it's progressing. Norman Rockwell, who was famous for his Saturday Evening Post illustrations, used an easel. And here's Jackson Pollock with his canvas on the floor, just throwing his paint on there. So a lot depends on what you're used to and how you perceive the subject matter that you're using. They've also included mosaics and tapestries in here, even though they are not technically drawing or painting. They can be adhered and applied to walls. Mosaics are images that are made by putting together small pieces of tile or stone or glass. One of the really great examples of this is really close to us. The Cathedral Basilica in St. Louis, Missouri is covered. All of the walls, most of the ceilings are covered with different mosaics, and it's incredible to see and to think about. If you think about ever laying tile, like for a floor or a wall or something like that, similar, except now you're using little bitty pieces and you're trying to get your colors to vary and things like that. Tapestries, that's a really heavy textile that has some very interesting and ornate designs formed in the weaving. A lot of tapestries originate from the Middle Ages. And if you think about, in some places in the Middle Ages, they lived in stone houses, castles, whatever, and the tapestries were put on the walls in order to kind of insulate them and make the rooms warmer. As they've excavated the city of Pompeii in Italy, if you remember, lots and lots of years ago, it was destroyed by a volcano. Because of the volcanic ash that came down at the rate it didn't necessarily destroy buildings, it just kind of encased them. So they have found a lot of mosaics there. The first one is a floor that they have found almost completely intact. The one on the right is a detail that you can see how they laid down the different colors of tile and created a very realistic looking piece of art. These are examples of a couple of panels from the unicorn tapestries, and more than likely those were hung on walls and things like that, not only as decoration, but also as an insulator. So in summary, we've talked about the techniques of encaustic painting, fresco, tempera painting, oil painting, water-based media, both transparent and opaque, acrylic painting, collage work, mosaic and tapestry. And we've got the key terms, pigment, which we've had before, vehicle or medium, the support, that's what it's put onto, ground or binder, fresco, secco, buon fresco, and cartoon, all dealing with frescoes. Gesso, which is used to prepare the surface for the paints. Glaze, alla prima, impasto, different kinds of painting, and easel, which is a tool used for painting.